Tenants in Illinois are upset that landlords decided to evict them anyway, even though they received rental assistance payments. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. Alright, so I have an interesting topic for you today, and it's going over the whole eviction moratorium and rental assistance nonsense that has been going on for quite a while now. So basically, tenants in Illinois are upset because their landlords received rental assistance money and they ended up getting evicted anyway. And they're crying foul. They're like, no, I wasn't supposed to be evicted. The rental assistance covered me. Well, here's the thing, right? I've explained this many times before, right? That the rental assistance did not cover 100% of the money that was owed to the landlords. And that means these people, even after they get approved for rental assistance and then the landlord gets paid, that means that they still owe the landlord a great deal of money. And so, yeah, a lot of landlords are still going to file for eviction. I'm not saying that's the case in this situation, but I'm going to explain, exactly what I think of this whole thing as we go through this article. So, of course, this article is taking the tenant side. It's one of those things. Oh, well, these evil, greedy landlords, they're screwing us tenants over. And, like all the newspaper articles and the journalists, they rarely talk to landlords to find out what our side of the story is, right? But you know what? I have to, just look at it from the perspective, an outside perspective, and think to myself, okay, there's a lot of information that is missing here. Like the landlords, and being a landlord, I know that no landlord wants to go through an eviction. Okay? No landlord wants to have to go through court and have to refill the unit if possible. So, to us, it is a last resort. So I don't doubt for 1 second there's much more to the story than what's being explained in the article. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like, subscribe button, and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. So are there any reasons why you personally evicted a tenant after receiving rental assistance? And I can speak personally about this because I did evict a tenant after receiving rental assistance for them, right? So basically the tenant, I got the rental assistance. They were able to catch back up on rent, but then they still weren't able to pay rent going forward. So they immediately fell into arrears again, and then I had to go through the eviction process. Actually, I filed the eviction paperwork and they ended up moving out. But, it's just one of those situations where you're just saying, okay, yeah, accepting the rental assistance will at least get me the money that was owed, from the past, but that doesn't help going into the future. And especially if you didn't get 100% of what was owed to you. So I'm just curious if other landlords have a similar story to, to mine. Anyway, let's get into this article and see what it says. This article is coming from IllinoisAnswers.org, and it says, landlord pushes tenants out despite getting state money. Tenants in an Inglewood apartment building are left out in the cold after their landlord pockets rental assistance with little oversight from the state. I always wonder, like for these so-called journalists, right? Like, how are you're thinking, oh, I'm doing this investigative report, and you didn't talk to the landlord, or you didn't even talk to a landlord. You just are guessing. I'm just gonna guess what their reasoning was. Well, that's the dumbest way. I mean, I guess if you have an agenda, and you're trying to push so that people lose their property rights, this is the kind of garbage that you would write. So let's get into this garbage article. There's not an important receipt that Nina Collier didn't keep, especially when it came to her rent. The 50-year-old proudly maintained a system she called foolproof. She kept every invoice and record of payment tucked in a Bible at her apartment in Inglewood. She said, if there was ever a question about whether she'd paid on time, Collier says she was ready to prove she did. That's something I don't play about, my rent and my car note, she told Illinois Answers Project in an interview. I was never behind. Not even through the COVID-19 pandemic when Collier lost her full-time job and worked sparingly as a maid. She was approved for government rental assistance that covered more than 2 years worth of her $900 a month rent, records show. And she said she maintained the same system, keeping every email, every invoice, and every receipt. So the first thing, she comes out and she says, oh, I kept all my invoices and all my receipts, and I always paid on time. Then they mention, but I lost my job during the pandemic and I ended up on rental assistance. And I'm like, wait a second here. If you always paid on time, then it's impossible for you to have paid on time if you needed rental assistance. It is impossible, okay? But now she's talking, well, my rental assistance money went to it. Well, keep in mind, right, the rental assistance, I don't know if it covered all the late fees. I don't know if it covered the entire time where you didn't pay rent. It says here that you had more than you received more than 2 years worth of your $900 a month rent. That means that you didn't pay rent for 2 years. Now, I don't know much about Illinois, so maybe somebody here can tell me, right? The pandemic began in 2020, and 2 years later was 2022, March of 2020. Let's say you went from March of 2020 all the way to March of 2022, and you didn't have a job that entire time except for as a maid. So you needed rental assistance for that entire time because you were unable to pay any rent. This in spite of the fact that there were expanded unemployment benefits during that time. This in spite of the fact that there were 3 separate stimulus checks during that time. Okay? I mean, I don't understand why you couldn't pay the rent. The only thing that this is telling me is that you took all that stimulus money, all that expanded unemployment money that probably was more than you were making per month, right? And you blew it on other garbage. Then you got rental assistance as well. And, I saved all my receipts as though you had paid perfectly, but you couldn't have paid perfectly because you ended up 2 years in arrears, 2 years behind. You got approved for 2 years assistance. So that means that you didn't pay rent for 2 years, and then they paid the 2 years in back rent at the end. Yeah, so you're sitting here questioning why is this landlord trying to evict me? Well, you left them high and dry for 2 years. So she was stunned when she faced eviction for allegedly being thousands of dollars behind. She found herself tearfully begging her landlord for relief in a court hearing over Zoom, hoping she'd be given a few extra days before getting kicked out. She was not. It turned my whole life upside down, said Collier, who wound up living on the street. Starting in the summer of 2022, about 8 months after the state's moratorium on evictions ended, Collier and 6 other tenants at 1150 through 1158 West 64th Street were all served eviction notices by Legacy Red, the company acting as manager of the building. 4 were eventually evicted. I feel bad for the lady. She ended up living on the street. But you got to question, right? Like, okay, now you had a job before. You apparently went 2 years without working. Why don't you just go back and get a job and then you could find somewhere to live? I mean, really, like this story, there's so much being left out of this, right? Like the person doing the interviewing, I know that they are, trying to create this sympathetic story, right? But there were no questions asked, right? You have to do a tough interview sometimes because if the person created the situation that they are in, and then they want to blame the landlord, but they created their own situation, then I got a big problem with that. I got a big problem because it makes us look bad, even though we are just, abiding by our business rules and our business practices. So, they could use this same excuse. She could use this same excuse to be like, well, I didn't make my car payment because, or, oh, I didn't pay my credit card because, how is not paying the landlord a appropriate situation and then being 100% dependent upon rental assistance, right? So, you probably still owe this landlord money, okay? The rental assistance, if the landlord even ever received the rental assistance, probably didn't cover every single penny that you owed. And that is why you're being evicted now. And I highly doubt that you even have a job now. So it's likely that you know, even after the rental assistance might have caught you up, it's highly likely that you continued to be in arrears after the rental assistance was paid, which might also be why the landlord filed, you know, just like what happened to me. So yeah, I mean, the story is extremely misleading. In interviews with Illinois Answers at the 10-unit apartment building in Inglewood, the neighbors all said they were surprised that they were dragged into court over allegations of unpaid rent because they'd collectively been approved for their rent payments, totaling tens of thousands of dollars in assistance from the state, paid directly to their landlord. Under the program's rules, tenants receiving those grants weren't supposed to face eviction. What's more, tenants complained they were subject to harassment or intimidation to get them to leave. Yeah, the excuses of the harassment and intimidation always come up. Oh yeah, they were harassing me. You know, a landlord asking for you to pay your rent is not harassment. That's just somebody asking for the money that you agreed to pay. And, you know, I think that a lot of these people, they use the harassment and intimidation excuse to garner sympathy, hoping that that will somehow spare them from eviction, but they have no proof or evidence of that, right? I mean, you've watched Judge Judy before, and a lot of the times these people will claim harassment and it will just be the landlord asking them to pay the rent. Okay? That's not harassment. That's just, you know, the person. I mean, how else are we supposed to get you to pay if we don't ask for the money? So, you know, like, if the courts went through the process and approved the eviction and everything was legitimate and legal, you know, that means that even if initially that if the person wasn't supposed to evict after receiving rental assistance, then they wouldn't have been approved by the judge. Okay, this eviction wouldn't have been approved by the judge. So I think these tenants are mistaken in the protections they thought they were going to receive. And you know what this really falls down to, and this is the problem I always had with these rental assistance programs, right? Creates a cycle of dependency. A cycle of dependency. This is what socialism does. These people are so dependent upon the government to pay their rent, they won't get off their own butts and then handle their own situation by going and getting a job and paying the landlord the money that they owe. Goodness, you know, like, rental assistance doesn't help anything with these tenants. Okay, the expanded unemployment benefits, you saw, if they didn't pay their rent when they were getting all that stimulus money for that long period of time, they will likely not ever be able to pay their rent. Now, you know, ladies living in a car rather than, or I don't know if she's living in a car, but she's homeless, okay? She's homeless because she couldn't handle her situation, right? So, you know, like I said, there's a lot of reasons why landlords would still evict the tenant even after receiving rental assistance. So let me know what you would do in this sort of situation.